the people who lived in any one place 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago are almost never directly ancestral to the people who live in that.
That's the single idea this entire story hangs on, and it applies to Ireland as much as anywhere else on Earth. 10,000 years before anyone said the words Black Irish, the first people who ever lived on that island already had black skin and blue eyes. The dark secret behind the Black Irish DNA was never a hidden bloodline at all. It's a slur invented in 19th century America to keep starving famine immigrants from being accepted as fully white, quietly repurposed by families hiding real African and indigenous ancestry just to survive. The real story was sitting in the DNA the entire time, and it's older and stranger than the myth ever managed to be. But before any of that makes sense, it helps to start with the myth itself, and the face people have spent generations arguing over. What Black Irish is supposed to mean, ask most people what an Irish face looks like, and they'll describe the same thing every time. Red hair, freckles, pale skin that burns after 10 minutes in the sun. But there's another Irish face that almost never makes it into that stereotype. One with jet black hair, dark eyes, and skin that tans instead of burns, sometimes carrying a faint olive tone underneath. For generations, people have had a name for it: Black Irish. Here's the part that should stop you before you go any further with this. Inside Ireland itself, almost nobody actually uses that phrase to describe dark-haired, pale-skinned locals. When people in Ireland do say Black Irish, they usually mean something else entirely. Irish citizens of Black African descent. In other words, the version of the term most people outside Ireland grew up hearing barely exists in the country it's supposedly describing. So if the term isn't really Irish, and it isn't really describing what people assume it describes, the obvious question becomes unavoidable. Where did it actually come from? And what, if anything, is it actually pointing to? The answer isn't simple, and untangling it means following 3 separate threads that keep getting tied into one. There's the story people love to tell about where this look comes from. There's a much stranger, much truer story about where the phrase itself comes from. Sits a genuinely fascinating scientific reality about Irish ancestry that has nothing to do with either one. Start with the story everyone already believes, because that's the one that falls apart first. The theory everyone's heard. This is the story you've probably already heard, told with enough confidence that nobody ever thinks to question it. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed against England, got wrecked by storms, and scattered along Ireland's coastline. Dark-haired, olive-skinned sailors staggered ashore, fell in love with local women, and left their looks behind in the bloodline for centuries to come. It's a great story, and it's almost entirely wrong. The numbers alone should raise a red flag. Roughly 5,000 Spanish sailors ended up shipwrecked on Irish and Scottish shores that year, and almost none of them got the fairy tale ending the legend implies. Most were killed outright by locals who saw shipwrecked enemy soldiers as a threat. Others were captured and handed over to English forces, who executed them. A small number were quietly smuggled back to Spain by sympathetic Irish clans, hoping Spain might return the favor with military support against England. That support never came. Even if you set aside how brutally most of those survivors actually met their end, the math still doesn't work. A tiny number of surviving sailors spread across a single year simply isn't enough to reshape the genetics of an entire national population, especially one that already had plenty of dark-haired people living in it long before 1588. And this isn't just modern doubt aimed at a nice story for the sake of tearing it down. Scientists have actually gone looking for direct evidence to settle the question. Population geneticists have searched for a Spanish genetic signature buried inside Irish DNA, and Dan Bradley, a population geneticist at Trinity College Dublin, who who has spent decades studying ancient Irish genomes, has been direct about what that search turned up. Essentially, nothing. No meaningful Spanish genetic signal shows up in the modern Irish population that could be traced back to 1588. So the Armada theory collapses under its own weight, 3 separate ways at once. Too few survivors, ending too violent for most of them to leave descendants behind, and no genetic trace left over to prove any of it happened anyway. Which raises an even stranger question. If dark-haired, pale-skinned Irish people didn't get that way from a shipwreck, then where did the actual phrase "Black Irish" come from in the first place? The answer isn't in Ireland at all, where the term actually came from. So if the phrase didn't come from a shipwreck off the Irish coast, someone had to invent it somewhere else. And the real answer takes this story in a completely different direction. Mary M. Burke, a professor at the University of Connecticut who researched the history of this exact term, traced its earliest documented use all the way back to the United States as early as the 1830s. That alone should be surprising. A phrase most people assume is ancient Irish folklore doesn't show up in the historical record until an American context, not an Irish one. The term spread widely after the Great Famine of the 1840s, when waves of Irish immigrants arrived in America desperate and destitute. But here's the part that changes everything about how this phrase should be understood. It wasn't invented to describe anyone's actual appearance at all. It was invented to draw a line between 2 groups of people. Earlier Irish immigrants, the ones who had arrived before the famine, had spent years trying to fit in with white Anglo-American society, working hard to avoid being classified as anything less than fully white. Then the famine hit, and a huge new wave of desperate, impoverished Irish immigrants showed up all at once. The earlier arrivals, along with the wider American establishment, needed a way to separate themselves from this new group. A way to say, these people are different from us. That's exactly the job Black Irish was built to do. Sit with that for a second, because it's worth sitting with. A phrase millions of families today treat as a charming, mysterious badge of exotic heritage started life as something much closer to an insult, aimed directly at their own ancestors. Not a compliment about dashing looks. A weapon built specifically to keep desperate immigrants out of full acceptance in their new country. And that wasn't even the ugliest chapter this term would go on to have. The darker use of the term. Because Black Irish didn't stay a story about excluding immigrants from whiteness. Somewhere along the way, it turned into something people used on themselves, and for reasons far more serious than borrowing a bit of unusual, romanticized ancestry. That shift happened gradually, as families realized a story built to exclude one group could also be repurposed to protect another. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Black Irish, alongside a similar phrase, Black Dutch, started showing up as something else entirely, a cover story. Real academic research on the Melungeon community, a mixed heritage population living in the American South, documented Black Irish as one of several invented explanations, stories claiming a mysterious, dark-featured European ancestor that families used specifically to explain away features that might otherwise suggest they had African or Native American ancestors somewhere in the family line. This wasn't a minor social preference at the time. It was survival. In an era when any non-white classification carried real legal consequences, families could lose the right to own property, vote, marry who they chose, or send their children to certain schools depending on how they were racially classified. So families invented alternate stories, anything but the truth. One piece of research on this exact pattern puts it plainly. Families would claim to be Black Dutch, Black Irish, Black French, or Native American because, as the research describes it, anything else would be better than admitting real African or indigenous ancestry, which meant facing active discrimination. Picture what that actually took to pull off. An entire fictional European bloodline, invented on purpose, then handed down from parent to child as though it were plain, ordinary family history, generation after generation, simply because the real story carried a danger the invented one didn't. Frame this plainly, without turning it into spectacle. For some families, Black Irish was never playful heritage branding, never a fun detail to mention at a dinner party. It was a story invented because the real one was too dangerous to say out loud. And once it worked, there was no reason to ever go back and correct it. And that same invented cover eventually traveled somewhere far more surprising than the American South. How the term got romanticized. Somewhere between being a slur and being a survival tactic, Black Irish went through one more transformation. And this last one had nothing to do with race at all. It had to do with storytelling. And it's what most people actually recognize today when they hear the phrase. That shift happened inside American fiction, where writers realized this same loaded term could be repurposed one more time, this time into something appealing rather than dangerous or exclusionary. Academic Christopher Dowd has specifically studied this transformation, tracing how early 20th century Irish-American authors, most directly F. Scott Fitzgerald, took the Black Irish identity and effectively acted it out on the page. No longer a marker of racial inferiority, but a darker and moodier character. Dark hair, dark eyes, a hint of mystery and danger. Exactly the description that makes a character memorable rather than marked as lesser. It's worth pausing on where that shift actually happened. This was fiction, written by novelists shaping characters for effect, not a historical or scientific record describing anything real. A romantic character type on a page is a completely different thing from a documented ancestral fact, even when readers start treating the two as though they're interchangeable. And Fitzgerald wasn't working alone in that mood. Around the same period, writers like Robert E. Howard, best known for creating Conan the Barbarian, were writing dark-haired, brooding Irish characters of his own, figures like Turlog and Black Vulmia, two of his recurring adventure heroes, built around that exact same aesthetic. Worth being precise here, Howard isn't part of the specific academic research tracing the Black Irish identity story the way Fitzgerald is. His work simply shows the same cultural mood showing up elsewhere in American fiction at the same time, which only underlines how widespread this romantic reimagining had become. Put all of that together, and here's what it actually means. The version of Black Irish most people recognize today, the cool, mysterious, exotic ancestry version, doesn't trace back to ancient Irish history at all. It comes from early 20th century American fiction, shaped by novelists who needed a compelling character type, built on top of a term that had already been an insult and a hiding place long before it ever became something people found charming. Every part of the story so far has been about the phrase itself, not the people it claims to describe. Who invented it? Who weaponized it? None of that has touched the one real question sitting underneath this entire conversation. What does actual Irish DNA show? What real Irish DNA actually shows? Set the folklore aside completely, because underneath all of it sits a scientific story stranger and better documented than any of the myths ever managed to be. This is where the answer actually lives. In 2015, a team from Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast published a landmark study in the journal PNAS, one of the most respected scientific publications in the world, built around whole genome sequencing of ancient human remains actually found in Ireland. This wasn't speculation built on modern DNA and guesswork about the past. This was direct genetic material pulled from real skeletons, thousands of years old. Here's exactly what that DNA revealed. The first individual was a woman, roughly 5,200 years old, found near Belfast. She was a farmer, and her genetic ancestry traces all the way back to the Fertile Crescent, the region often called the birthplace of agriculture, spanning parts of the modern Middle East. Her ancestors' journey to Ireland ran through the Mediterranean, and her closest genetic relatives today live in Spain and Sardinia. Her genetic reconstruction shows something specific and striking: a genuine tendency toward black hair and brown eyes, encoded directly in her DNA thousands of years before anyone had invented a word like Black Irish. But she wasn't the only story this ancient DNA had to tell. The second discovery came from Rathlin Island, where researchers found 3 men from the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years old. Their genetic signal told a completely different story from the farmer woman. Roughly 1/3 of their ancestry traced back to the Pontic Steppe, a region covering parts of modern Russia and Ukraine. An entirely separate population had arrived in Ireland by this point, carrying different genes from a different part of the world entirely. These Bronze Age men carried something else worth noting directly: the genetic markers for lactose tolerance, meaning the ability to digest milk into adulthood, rather than losing that ability after childhood, the way most humans historically did. And they also carried the genetic marker for hemochromatosis, a hereditary condition causing the body to store excess iron, a condition still so common in Ireland today that it's sometimes nicknamed the Celtic disease. None of this required any Spanish shipwreck to explain it, or any American slur dreamed up centuries later. Real, ancient, physically recovered DNA already tells a story of multiple distinct populations arriving in Ireland thousands of years apart, each one leaving a different genetic signature behind. And the deepest layer of that story, the very first Irish population of all, turns out to be the strangest one yet. The real Dark Irish. Every population this story has covered so far still leaves out the very first people who ever lived on the island at all, and going back to find them is where this gets genuinely strange. Irish Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived in Ireland roughly 10,000 years ago, long before farming, long before anything resembling the Ireland most people picture. Researchers recovered ancient DNA from remains found in the Burren, a rocky limestone landscape in County Clare. Dr. Laura Cassidy, a geneticist at Trinity College Dublin who specializes in exactly this ancient DNA work, led the genetic analysis, and what she found wasn't what anyone expected walking into the study. These hunter-gatherers had dark, possibly black, skin and blue eyes to go with it.
It was excavated in Cheddar Gorge, where cheddar cheese is made, and we have their DNA, and their DNA corresponds to someone who you can genetically predict, had very, very dark skin, almost like what you would expect from Nigeria or something like this, and blue eyes, like a combination that's very rare.
That specific combination isn't some minor curiosity buried in a footnote. Dark skin paired with light-colored eyes closely mirrors one of the most well-known cases in the entire field of ancient DNA research. The Cheddar Man discovery in Britain, a roughly contemporary hunter-gatherer whose ancient DNA revealed that exact same pairing, dark skin and blue eyes together, in a country most people assume has always looked the way it looks today. Put those two findings side by side, and a bigger scientific point comes into focus. Lighter skin in European populations was never some fixed racial trait stretching all the way back to the dawn of humanity. It's a comparatively recent development in evolutionary terms, one that showed up later as farming populations spread further north into regions with less sunlight and needed to adapt. Dark skin was the actual starting point for the people who lived here first, not some later addition brought in from somewhere else. This finding has been replicated and is well established in the field, not a one-off headline. And it means the genuinely dark-skinned original inhabitants of Ireland were already here millennia before the Vikings ever landed, long before a single Spanish sailor ever set foot anywhere near the Irish coast. Irish people are actually most closely related to. So if it wasn't Spanish sailors that shaped how modern Irish people look and where their ancestry actually traces to, the real answer comes from a completely different direction, and it's been sitting quietly in the genetic data the entire time, waiting for someone to actually look. Modern genetic studies consistently show that the closest living relatives to Irish populations aren't found in Spain by way of any 1588 shipwreck at all. They're found in the Basque region of northern Spain, an area with its own distinct ancient population history that predates the Armada by thousands of years, along with a broader, more general connection to the populations of Scotland and, to a lesser extent, England. One specific genetic marker makes this connection especially clear. The Y chromosome haplogroup known as R1b, a marker passed down directly from father to son, shows up at strikingly high concentrations in both Ireland and the Basque Country. A real, well-documented overlap confirmed across multiple independent studies. But it's important to be precise about what it actually means. This connection reflects ancient shared migration patterns from thousands of years ago, populations moving and settling across Western Europe long before recorded history began, not the Spanish Armada, and not any other later historical event people commonly point to. This is the actual, evidence-based answer to a question people have been asking for centuries. Why do some Irish people look a little Spanish? The honest answer has nothing to do with any single dramatic historical moment at all. It has everything to do with population movements that happened millennia earlier, leaving genetic echoes that still show up clearly in DNA today. Nobody needed to invent a shipwreck to explain the black-haired Irish. The real story was hiding in a 19th century American slur and 10,000-year-old bones that never made the myth necessary. The dark secret was never in the blood. It was in the word.